Nice to have you back.
Okay.
Nice to have you back.
Yeah, nice to be back.
Yeah, we missed you. All right, recording has started.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go through my notes from the accounting and auditing update. So, such as 100 that just came out. We got another exposure draft coming out. It's going to be dealing with restatements and that sort of stuff. I don't know if you know what the yellow book is, but there's a new one of those coming out that kind of governs governmental auditing standards. There were a whole bunch of new SASs that came out. Risk disclosures are going to be putting out an exposure draft. So they would end up tweaking what kind of disclosures we do related to our risks. They're working on a new definition of going concern. Working on classification of non-financial assets. Financial reporting model release date is now fourth quarter of 2023. The new concept statement for disclosures should be released here soon. They're working on capital assets and subsequent events. So the 100 are the changes and error corrections. 101 will be coming out soon, and that's compensated absences. What? Hold on. Yeah, that was kind of the highlights from that one. So anyway, capital assets. What is capitalizable? So original acquisition cost. Training has always been kind of a baffling one. It always seems like you can't use the software unless you get trained in it. But or a piece of equipment, how to use it. But you can, like, if there is somebody that's assigned to put the machinery together or whatever, their cost of training is capitalizable, but everybody that's going to be using it, their training is not capitalizable. Internal costs after the planning stage, cost to prepare a site for use, cost to increase utility or extend the useful life of an existing asset. So like bumping a road out from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. And then donated assets, we get a bunch of those. And right about now, it's usually when those all get booked. So like Peabody and sewer and water get a lot of those types of things, but they usually accumulate it during the year and then put it in. And estimated historical costs is where we find something old that hasn't been put on the books yet, or there's a new standard, like when they told us that intangible assets have to be recorded. We had to go back and try to figure out what the historical cost at the date of acquisition was. And usually how we do that is estimate what it would cost today and then price adjust it backwards. Figuring out the planning stage part of it is important. Like when we're talking about SAP, they started off saying we need an ERP system. And then we were studying the different ERP systems. And all of the costs during that phase are not capitalizable because you haven't picked a solution yet. But once we picked SAP as a solution, then all the costs from that moment forward started becoming capitalizable. There are some, with the advances in how or changes, maybe advances not right. The changes in how software is done now, where it used to be you would buy software and now you kind of rent it. So we're coming into GASB 96. So like Water Bureau this year started implementation of a new software platform, but it was going to take a year or two to actually implement. So they went ahead and capitalized the initial licensing fee, even though we weren't in the GASB 96 yet. And they contacted GASB and got a statement from GASB that yes, even though 96 isn't around yet, that first year cost, because you had to pay that before anybody could start working on it and doing the programming and implementation stuff that was needed. So but once we get to 96, now we'll be capitalizing the net present value of the life of the contract. So that's kind of that page. Impairments needs to be significant and unexpected. Indicators of impairments are physical damage, changes in laws, environmental factors, technology changes. The example they give in the book, I think, is like a MRI or some medical technology where you bought it expecting it to last 10 years, but in year 4, brand new technology comes out and makes it obsolete, and you're going to get rid of it and buy something new. Change in service, utilities, stoppage of construction, and we've had that. If not going to use it anymore, becomes an asset for resale, and then we book it at fair value. If you continue to use it, you write it down, and then take the restoration approach and service unit approach or alternatives. So we had something like this recently where the headwater department building, their roof failed, and that not only caused the roof to need to be replaced, but like the top floor of the apartment buildings got rain damage and other kind of damage. And so we had to write down the asset for the value of that top floor, and then we figured out what the restoration cost was, and then added that back. So you need to write down the initial asset, so because the roof was gone and the top floor was gone, so basically had to just write all that off, and then created a new addition to the asset for the construction cost to replace everything. But ultimately, I think it's GASB 42 that talks about impairments, and realistically, when you run into the situation, you just have to go back and read the standard and walk yourself through the process, because there's multiple approaches to it, and you just have to figure out which one works for your situation and follow it. What's next? Depreciation, amortization. So fixed assets we depreciate, tangible assets we amortize. Has to be systematic and rational allocation. We do straight line, and we begin in the year after it's placed in service, except for leases. And then we start in the year where the contract is signed to depreciate a lease.
So if an asset was purchased July 1st of 2022, when do we start depreciation?
July 1st to 2030.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's what's the lease, in which case it would start depreciating right away. And there's some things that we track as a system. Now, if I remember correctly, the way depreciation works is that you always get a year's worth of depreciation in the year that you started, which for most things makes sense because we're not starting the depreciation until July 1st of the following year. But with leases, that's one of the trade-offs that we gave up there was if we signed a lease on June 1st, we would set it up in the system and it would get 12 months of depreciation, even though we only had it for 1 month. That was kind of, yeah, I mean, what ultimately it's not material difference one way or the other. But we ended up making the decision to change how we do the depreciation for leases as compared to everything else. Oh, debt. Liabilities due to third parties that are long-term and have a defined repayment schedule. Deep discounted debt requires accretion of interest. And refundings, advance versus current, defeasance, advance refundings become contingent debt. But just disclose the notes. Conduit debt. That's basically where, say, Home Forward, which is our housing authority, were to use us as if they wanted to tap into our AAA bond rating, they could issue debt kind of in our name with every intention that they're going to make all the payments. We don't have to put it on our books unless it becomes apparent that we're actually going to have to make the payment. So that's conduit debt. Arbitrage. So that's basically the delta between how much we're paying in interest expense and then how much we earn by investing that money. And we use, that's why we deposit proceeds into sub funds so we can clearly track how much interest was earned and how much paid so that we can do those calculations and prove to the IRS that we didn't have an arbitrage. If we do, then then there's a penalty and we have to pay the IRS to make up the difference. So economic resources, we show the liability, the deferred inflows and outflows. For current financial resources, we show proceeds, principal, and premium and discount in the flow statements. So I'll back up to advanced versus current. I think I explained that before. Usually, we haven't been doing much in the way of advanced refundings because that it hasn't made economic sense, particularly because basically, so the advanced refunding, what's happening is you haven't reached the point defined in the bond document where you can actually refund it. So we issue 20-year bonds usually, and for the most part, they say at the 10-year mark, we can call them and pay them off. So, and that's usually what we do. If you look at the refundings that are happening every year, it's right at the 10-year mark. So it'd be bonds that are originally issued in 2012. We're now going back through and refunding them because the interest rates are lower now than they were 10 years ago. Now, as interest rates go up here that may stop being the true, but to do an advance refunding, you would be like at the 8-year mark, and you can't legally pay off, call those bonds and pay them off. So what you have to do is you have to buy, I think it's usually a treasury document. Treasury bond, no, it's some kind of special treasury facility that they usually use. And it's deposited in an escrow account. And you have to have enough to pay the interest and the principal over the course of those 2 years that are left before you can actually legally call them. So the economic issue there becomes how do you get a treasury instrument that pays enough interest so that you can actually pay everything off at the interest rate that's at the base of the bond, because treasuries have been so much lower than what we're paying. So anyway, we haven't done much for advance refunding. And then in the 2017 tax bill, they made changes that take away advance refunding that really is an option. And that's one of the things that we've been lobbying for the last few years through GFOA, is to try to get advance refundings put back onto the table, to go back into the tax law and change that. Deep discounted debt, we do have some of that, like those Bob's bonds. I think it's the C deferred. So the situation there is that, I mean, normally when you sell bonds, it's usually like $5,000 increments, and then we receive the 5,000 plus or minus a discount or a premium, and then when it comes due, we're paying back $5,000. So with discount debt, zero coupon, the variety of terms for it, it's in repayment. We have to pay 5,000, but when we sell them, we might get 1,000. And then there's no interest payments over the whole course of the life of the bond. It's the delta between whatever we receive from it on day one and how much we're having to pay at the end of the contract. That's basically the interest. So what we have to do is every month we make an entry to accrete interest rather than accrue interest. So normal bonds, we accrue interest. On the zero coupon, we're accreting interest over the life up to a certain point. When we start calling the bonds and pay them back, and then the accretion starts to reverse. I think we're probably about that point. We'd have to look at the schedules to see, but I think those are starting to come due here soon for the POBS bonds. Now, I think we did something similar with the convention center, one of the convention center, and I think that one has actually started to reverse. We started making the payments. So anyway, it's kind of interesting.
You were saying, the payment is in multiple of 5,000.
Yeah, generally the bonds are sold in
Yeah.
$5,000 increments.
So in case we miss that regulations and we pay not exactly 5,000, then we have to reverse that, or what is the rule?
Well, generally when we sell it, there's going to be some bonds that aren't 5,000 because we usually don't round off to that exact amount. But generally, that's that's kind of the norm for governmental bonds is they're sold in $5,000 increments, but when you look at the amount that we sell, it usually doesn't round off to, you can't divide it evenly by 5,000, so there's obviously some of them that aren't 5,000. And I can remember when I started off, it was bearer bonds, and there was little coupons attached to it, and every year you clip off your coupon, take it in, and get your interest payment. And then when it was time to bring in the bond, you would actually bring in your bearer bond and hand it over to the treasurer, and you would get paid for it. But now it's all done electronically.
Okay, good. Instead use that coupon so easily.
And it happens.
Small coupon?
Yeah, they're about like this, but it's inch and a half, 2
Oh
inches
my God,
wide.
that is
and
fascinating.
Yeah, and then, so you'd have the bond, and then there would be like a row of coupons.
Then you just read
And
it.
you would just cut them and cut one off every year, or every 6 months, however often they paid.
That's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, the IRS and federal government didn't care for that because basically then you've got stuff that you can just hand the bond to somebody, and all of a sudden you purchased or something from them or paid off a debt, but nothing electronic has ever happened, and nobody actually knows that the money has changed hands.
Same thing with stock certificates. I mean, it's all electronic now, but when I was a legal assistant, we used to have to prepare them, and there was like very specific language that you had to have printed on the back legally,
Yeah.
so that people know, because you have interest in businesses that are just swapping.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So anyway, those have been gone for a long time, but
So now it's all electronic.
and at least for us. I'm sure there's some places in the world where there's still bearer bonds.
You go to the treasurer's office and look for the books.
Yeah.
I remember that. Those days.
So
You
anyway.
got the number of. Yeah.
Next one.
Okay, derivatives. We do not do these.
Is that a policy? Like an internal city policy that,
So if I remember correctly, we have a city policy that allows us to do interest rate swaps. And we have never done it. I think it is allowable. They've been popular for governments in the past, but as a general rule, every government that I've heard about that got into and lost money, because you have to have a tremendous amount of expertise. So, I mean, basically what you're dealing with is you have outstanding debt with variable interest rates, and you're doing, like you're swapping a variable interest rate for a fixed interest rate one, or vice versa. And then your whole risk comes down to, is that interest rate going to be increasing above your fixed rate or fall below your fixed rate? So it's risky, and we haven't done it, but there are a lot of governments that do it. Now, there are other types of derivatives that I sort of wondered why we haven't experimented with, like hedging. So realistically, given the way gasoline and diesel prices are going, maybe it might make sense to go on the commodities exchange and buy gasoline futures or diesel futures to just lock in a price. Now that the risk is that prices will go back down again below the amount of the future, and you'll end up paying more than you would have had if you didn't hedge it. But on the other side of the equation, you lock it in, you know exactly, this is how much I'm gonna have to pay for gasoline for the next year. And so you have a known amount. So that would be another type of derivative that we can get into.
Or not. Can I ask you a
That's-
question?
As far as I know, it's there.
Oh,
Yeah,
Kevin
but
has a
Kevin has
question.
a question.
Go
For the
ahead,
interest
Kevin.
rates- For the interest rate swaps, would we be more likely to do that if they go up? Or not?
He
Interest
said
rates-
for the interest rate swaps, we be more likely to do it if they go up?
So interest rates are going up. And we have, all of our debt is fixed interest rates at the moment. So you wouldn't want to swap a fixed interest rate for variable when you know interest rates are going up, because you're gonna end up paying more than what you what you're locked into with your fixed rate. But if you thought that interest rates were gonna start going down,
Then,
and that would be an alternative to refunding a bond. So if you're at the 8-year mark where we're talking about, and you have a fixed rate bond, and you go through a period like we've been through where interest rates are going down and you're wanting to refund it, we could swap for a variable rate and hope that rate really would go down over the course of the next 2 years before we could actually do a current refunding. So there could be a situation like that where it actually would make sense. But again, you're betting, and they're very complex instruments, and the level of expertise required to really understand and make an educated bet, because you're gambling. And the people on the other side are experts in these type of things and really, really smart, and they have really fancy
sophisticated.
programs, computer programs and modeling on their side. So basically, from a gambling perspective, they're the house, and they're probably gonna win because they know the game way better than we do. But like I said, quite a few governments over the years have made that bet and oftentimes lost, but some of them have won. So anyway, if we ever do get into derivatives, we'll really have to go back and read the Gatsby's that talk about how derivatives are handled and educate ourselves, because it is complicated.
We don't have any items under derivatives.
No.
That would be a pretty big undertaking.
Yeah, but I mean, it could happen. It's been a long time since those were really pushed to governments. There's probably 2000 to 2010, kind of in that period where a lot of companies were trying to push those kind of things onto governments. But I really haven't heard a lot about it, or anybody really marketing those kind of instruments in 10 years or more. So
It's like by regulations, I'm just wondering why should anyone approve that kind of activities, because I thought government should be always on the safe side, right? We should always protect the asset of the rather than put it under risk.
In a gamble.
Yeah, because a lot of people felt they could win. So they made the bet, and If I remember correctly, we have a policy that allows it, but I don't think, we just have never done it yet. But that policy, I think, dates back to that era when those types of things were
Popular?
popular. Yeah, at one point I came across a document where they were trying to market it to us. But that was 2008 or 2009 that I saw that, and it was a few years old at that point, so. So anyway, that's the derivative story. Environmental obligations, landfill closure and post-closure, pollution remediation, asset retirement obligations. These are costs incurred to either avoid environmental damage or remediate existing damage. And these are things like sewage treatment. Things like sewage treatment are operating costs and are part of normal operations, not environmental. Do I have any more slides on this? If not, I'll go ahead and.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so. Landfill closure and post-closure, community owns the landfill, estimates the cost to close at the end of the useful life, and monitor the site through the period required by the EPA or the Oregon DEQ, which I think is around 30 years. And then you have to remeasure every year over the life of the landfill. So the cost would be the cost to cap the site, install monitoring wells, equipment and labor. And the cost is expensed over the period that the landfill is in operation. And the liability increases each year until the closure happens. Then instead of taking cost to expense as the closure and monitoring happen, the liability is reduced. So due to updating estimates, so that there could be an expense recorded if the liability is insufficient. So the normal situation is you have a landfill and they're usually broken down into cells, and you're filling up a cell. And right at the beginning, you estimate, okay, this is going to be available for 30 years or whatever the estimated life, however long you think it is going to take to fill up your landfill. And then you estimate how much is it going to cost to cap it, and then monitor and do everything you have to do over the entire life of the post-closure period, which is again another 30 years. So it could be 60 years. So 30 years, you're reporting expense every year and setting up, increasing your liability over the entire life of the useful life of being able to fill it up.
So in terms of like for our team, how would our team become aware of like an asset retirement obligation? So for example, in my mind, if there's a scenario where like a property manager or somebody like that's more on the contract side, on like the off side, becomes aware of that, like I guess I'm kind of wondering what would be the trigger that would make that light bulb go on and would make them go, hey, accounting team, just so you know, we have this obligation to, what would be the triggering mechanism that would alert us to know, hey, we have an obligation that we need to disclose? So
asset recovery obligations, there has to be a legally binding document.
Okay.
It could be a court case, or it could be a contract. So I forget which city it is. It's one of the smaller cities in Oregon. So they had a situation where they were leasing land from, I don't know if it was from the county or whoever, but they were leasing land. And they installed a swimming pool on that piece of land. And one of the requirements in the lease was that at the end of the lease, they had to restore the site to the exact same condition that it was in before the lease began. That is a good example of an asset recovery, because you know at the beginning of it, when you sign the contract, that you have a cost obligation at the end of the contract to remove that swimming pool and put the site back into its original condition.
So it sounds like maybe one of the avenues that could happen, that information can make it to us, it's like through like a lease evaluator, for example. If they're looking through like a new lease or something, and then they see some sort of like contractual obligation to, like what you said, like, okay, you have to remove the pool and restore it to exactly how it was when you first got it. So that might be something that the lease evaluator would have to like know to follow up on.
Well, we need material too, so.
Right.
Now, we thought about wastewater treatment plants. But then, I mean, we kind of got, one thing is, it's so hard to get a release permit to release into the river that we probably never ever closed a wastewater treatment plant, because we'd have to build a new one and work with the state to get a new permit to release into the river. But even if that wasn't true, we still have to have some kind of legal document that requires you to restore the site of the treatment plant back to its original condition. Now, there is a possibility with our electrical. So at the dam, there are turbines up there, and we're producing electricity, hydropower. Now, if we ever decide to shut that down, there will FERC, which is the federal electrical something or other, that they have power over all of the electrical utilities in the country, and they define their own accounting standards. And so anyway, if we decided to shut that down, FERC we would have to negotiate a contract with FERC, and they would tell us, okay, you've got to do this, 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 and this as part of the shutdown process, and that would trigger an asset recovery asset. And we'd have to book that and put that on the books. So that's kind of the one instance that we've identified where we might have to eventually have one of those, but so far we haven't identified where we have any of these. We do have a couple, 3 of these, but they're odd because well, one of them was a landfill at one point in time. So it was run by a company that basically went bankrupt. And then DEQ went through all the processes to actually do what was necessary to close it down. And I think Metro and City somehow ended up with the expectation that we do the monitoring and fix anything that goes wrong. And it's a park, I think. The other weird one was had to do with BES, and they had been cleaning up something for several years and had created a landfill type situation to put all that toxic stuff that they were collecting and cleaning out. But they didn't bother. The engineers just did their stuff and didn't bother to tell anybody in the finance side that they were doing it, or didn't register with the people on the finance side. Until it came time to sign a contract with Oregon DEQ saying, okay, we assert the city of Portland has the economic wherewithal to do the monitoring and do any correcting steps and stuff. So the CFO had to sign that document, and the CFO signing that document, he kind of brought it to finance people's attention. And then we booked the liability subsequent to everything being done. So it should have been done incrementally as they were filling up the site, but it didn't actually get done until it was actually over with.
Is that the incinerator? The Guilds Lake?
Could be, I can't remember exact details. It's been a while since I
Probably.
looked at that. I think it sounds right.
Mhm.
I just did like a search on our aquifer for like landfill, and I was just kind of going through. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff. That's like so cool.
Yeah. So anyway, we don't have a lot of landfill issues. Metro is more along those lines, and then in the companies that they work with that actually run the landfills in the area. But we do have a couple instances where it affects us.
Good to know.
Yeah. Environmental obligations. Oh, yeah, here I'm talking about the landfills. So asset retirement obligation, there has to be a contract or law. So it could be a state law or a federal law that requires it. So that would be FERC. So FERC would be an example of a law. They would have things that they would specify have to be done. Nuclear facilities are one of the big examples. But it has to be an external obligating event. It can't be just us deciding we want to do something. Has to be somebody outside of the city saying that we have to do this. Environmental remediation of past pollution, estimate costs to conduct remediation using current costs. Doesn't include costs to avoid future pollution. Recognize liability in the year that can estimate, and that's critical to it. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have to reassess annually. And this is triggered by an obligating event such as imminent danger, or the public or environment, violation of permit or license, named as a potential responsible party, lawsuit, involuntary commitment. So our big one here is Portland Harbor. We have a bunch of smaller ones where we own property that was a brownfield, basically. Either, I think most of them we have bought land that somebody else had polluted, and we ended up with the brownfield obligation to remediate it. But Portland Harbor is the big one. But the big issue there is that how do you estimate it? And for that particular one, there's two unknowns. One is what is the total cost to remediate? And the second unknown is what percentage of that remediation is our responsibility, because there are a whole bunch of companies and a whole bunch of governmental entities that had some involvement in creating the problem. So how much is our part is a legal issue, and the lawyers have been working on that for years. Then we still don't have an answer. And then how much is it really gonna cost? EPA came up with an initial estimate of 1 billion. I've heard estimates as high as 3 billion. But it's still an unknown at this point. So we haven't booked a total liability yet. We have some estimates of how much of specific issues that we know belong to that we are responsible for, and so and we have estimates of what it's going to cost to fix those. So we booked those liabilities, but the bulk of the liability hasn't been booked yet. And we have that discussion with the auditors every year. So anyway, that's our big one. And now it talks. It does talk about. You can have a range of estimates of costs and assign probabilities to each of the estimates. But since we got estimates along 2 different types of estimates, we haven't made an attempt yet to estimate total costs and our percentage of it. Anyway, that one. We'll eventually get taken care of in court, I think. But we're not there yet. So it has to be probable and measurable, and then the range of possible dollar amounts. If none is more likely, use the low end of the range. And that's kind of what we've been doing with that one. And you can't recognize gain until realized. And you can't assign a probability to each possible amount and use weighted average to calculate the liability. Well, there are a variety of options that the standard talks about to actually how do you measure this, because it can be difficult to figure out exactly what the damage is and what it's going to cost to remediate it. Okay, there are significant legal issues involved in this. That's an understatement. Recoveries are recognized to the extent that they are considered probable. There could be other parties involved, and you're going to go ahead and do the cleanup yourself, but you're going to eventually try to collect from other parties. Like in the cases where we bought land that is polluted, we could try to go after the entity that
The seller?
the entity that actually polluted it.
Oh.
Cost is incurred to prepare property for resale. Permit cost of period may be capitalized if we're incurring the cost of resale. So you could end up with a massive cost on a piece of property just because the remediation costs were so high, and then you're going to end up selling it for a loss. Costs incurred with connection with the property's purchase at a discount. So sometimes you're not going to try to recover from that other party because you bought it at a deep discount, recognizing that it was going to have to be remediated before it could be used. Cost to restore the service capacity to an impaired asset, and costs that provide additional value. So that's I think some of the properties we've purchased, we turn around and reselling later after we've remediated the damage. So that has happened, but it's not a real common thing, but that's the process we would go through. So whatever we pay for it, and we would add on whatever it costs to do the remediation. And then if we were gonna build something on it to make it more marketable, that too. Risk financing insurance, managing risk, joining a risk pool, self-insurance. The city isn't in any risk pool. We are sort of, some people say we're self-insured for liability and workers' comp. Vaught, we are definitely self-insured there with stop loss policies. But under the true definition of self-insured and Oregon law, we aren't self-insured for liabilities and workers' comp. We basically have insurance policies with high deductibles. So we're agreeing to cover a big chunk of the initial cost, and then if it reaches a certain level, then the insurance company steps in and starts paying. Same sort of thing happens with health insurance. I don't know the exact numbers here, but like if a medical claim, like in $500,000, then stop loss start kicking in and start paying for the. That would be like an individual claim. Like a premature baby can be $500,000 or more. So for that one claim, if you hit that stop loss number, then the insurance company will start paying. Risk pools, like in Montana, I think all the governments there are in risk pools. So like all the cities have a risk pool for liability and workers' comp. Because you need a fairly good size group to be actuarially sound for a risk pool like that. So basically what they did in Montana was they sold bonds to fund the pools. And then everybody that belonged to the pool kicked in money every year. Basically premiums that help to pay off the bonds, plus pay off current costs. So I would guess it's something similar happens in Oregon, but I haven't dealt with small governments here to know. Could be that they're all just buying insurance. But in Montana, it was really popular. So the cities had one, the counties had one, the school districts had one. So it's a good way to spread your risk out. And the goal being to come up with a lesser cost than if you just go out and buy insurance. Which seems to be getting more pricey with each passing year or so. Risk financing insurance, liability recognition, what is due and payable at year end. And then what is incurred but not reported, the IBNR. So we hire actuaries to tell us that.
Is that what IBNR is referring to?
Mhm.
Incurred but not reported. So basically, on June 30th, if there's some kind of liability claim, I mean, somebody has hit we've hit somebody's house or a fence or car or whatever with one of our cars, but they haven't gotten around to filing a claim against the city yet. So the actuary kind of looks at past history and based on actuarial methods, comes up with an estimate of how much hasn't been reported yet. So we use internal service funds to manage this. And we recognize recoveries when they are realizable. And FEMA that's handled through the grant fund, and the revenue is recognized when all the eligible requirements have been met, which with FEMA can be years after you actually recognize the expenditure, because the requirements to get reimbursed from FEMA are pretty strict. And subrogation, that's kind of the opposite. That's where somebody runs into something that the city owns and they have to pay us. So we're collecting money from insurance companies or individuals for damages that they've done to city property. And the liability fund manages all of that for the city. And for America, they got like 10% of the recovery for their services, and the rest of the money goes to the Vaught or general fund or wherever the asset that was damaged lives. So it's kind of the simple version of all that. But we have liability people that do nothing but deal with that all day long, every day. So it is complicated.
Yeah, who does that?
Yeah.
There's people over here.
Oh, okay.
Risk management.
I have a whole group of people. Some of them are doing liability, and some of them are doing workers' comp. So anyway, it's definitely a specialty. We definitely have a bunch of people working on it, so there must be a lot of that type of activity.
Yeah. So we're at 4 o'clock.
Yeah,
Like we'll stop at
Page 95.
94.
Oh,
Start next.
94.
yeah, I'm gonna have one further. Because the next slide